Welcome to another online learning lecture with Mr. Regas. We recently talked about internationalism, what it is, and then the United Nations, kind of one of our best examples of internationalism. If you remember from the previous lecture, the United Nations is made up of 193 countries. It has six main organs, and the three we looked at were the General Assembly, Security Council, and the International Court of Justice. And the previous lecture was more of an objective look at it, just how it's made up, what it does. Today, we're going to look at some of the criticisms of the UN. There are lots of criticisms, there are a lot of opinions floating around about the UN, many of which believe that it should result in the UN getting disbanded. Now, we'll look at some of these in greater detail. The four main criticisms are philosophical and moral, administrative, effectiveness, and diplomatic and political criticisms. So, the philosophical and moral criticisms of the United Nations. The first thing this has to do is with moral relativism. So, the definition of this, the position that moral or ethical propositions do not reflect objective and or universal moral truths, but instead make claims relative to social, cultural, historical, or personal circumstances. The reason moral relativism is used as a criticism here is because it can be used to justify immoral practices. So Hitler used this to justify the Holocaust. The UN was also founded by states that declared war on the Axis powers during World War II, so formed to take a stand against evil and oppressive regimes. So there is a lot of morality from one perspective that went into the forming of the United Nations. However, today, if we look at the United Nations, there's 75 member states who are non-democratic. And the UN oftentimes has a neutral stance or occasional support of terrorism and genocide. So this argument of moral relativism, moral relativism is quite powerful. Some other examples of this. After the death of Kim Jong-il, the dictator of North Korea, the UN held a moment of silence to mourn him. Now, you might say, if the UN was founded on principles of morality or democracy, why would we be holding a vigil or a moment of silence for a leader of the 20th century who's responsible for hundreds of thousands or millions of deaths? The UN also allows member nations to remain in the UN despite them committing crimes which go against the UN's founding principles. Countries such as Saudi Arabia, Iran, North Korea. So this is one of the criticisms of the UN. There's also allegations of globalism. So this is actually something I've been seeing a lot of recently in Canada, being aimed at people like Justin Trudeau or some of the chief medical officers in Canada during the COVID-19 crisis. So some believe that the UN is attempting to be a global government. So this allegation is criticizing that the UN can infringe on the sovereignty of individual member states. Some examples of this would be through the use of organizations such as the WTO, the World Bank, or the IMF. Again, for these organizations to be used, countries have to go along with those decisions, which means giving up a bit of sovereignty. The administrative criticisms of the UN. So there's a lot of criticism surrounding the role of elite countries. This is especially regarding the five permanent members of the UN, so China, France, Russia, Britain, and the United States. All five of these countries possess nuclear weapons that are unchecked. So they preach things like the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. So it's kind of like somebody shaking their finger at you and saying, do as I say, not as I do. The Security Council has no true international representation. These 5 countries control all UN major decisions, and so many nations argue that there should be reforms to the Security Council. One of these reforms that people argue for is that one of the permanent members must be a non nuclear power. Some also accuse the Security Council of only acting in their best interests and not those that are best for the world as a whole. One of the best examples of this criticism is that the Security Council and the countries who acted in here were extremely quick to intervene in the Kuwait War. So this stopped Saddam Hussein from invading oil rich Kuwait. They came in with a large force, they stopped it. Yet in Rwanda, when 800,000 people are hacked to death with machetes, the world stood by and do nothing. So there are a lot of allegations that the Security Council or the UN only acts when it's serving certain nations' interests. There's also criticism towards the democratic character of the UN. So some critics believe that the UN is not a true democracy, and they believe that the leaders at the UN are representing their own interests at the General Assembly and the Security Council, but not actually those of the citizens they're supposed to represent. If this is the case, that would definitely be a failure. There's also criticisms of the effectiveness of the UN. So some argue, is the UN even relevant anymore? Some argue that due to the makeup of the Security Council, that the UN is not effective in preventing or resolving conflicts. The UN is able to observe and report on international conflicts, but without approval of the Security Council, it cannot act with force. Now, this next statistic is one that I guess either opinion could be right. But through some different studies, it's been said that the United Nations is successful in about 67 or 2/3 of the peacekeeping efforts they have. So, but what about the other 33%? Now, both sides could argue here. The one side could say that the fact that 67% were successful means that is a huge success, right? You could say that's great. That means in all these different cases that were successful, the UN actually helped. The other 33%, though, you might argue that this is too large of a failure. It shouldn't go unnoticed, and that means they're not successful enough. However, for this, it would be important to look at what would the other 67% look like without the international intervention. We'll talk about this stuff more later. There's also diplomatic and political criticism of the UN. So this has to do with, again, the inability to prevent conflicts. So in many cases of mass death and suffering, there's been little to no consequences for nations who commit genocide, crimes against humanity, or human rights violations. In most cases, the UN forces did nothing to prevent genocide or war from occurring in conflict zones. So there's even been times when peacekeepers have had to sit idly by and witness slaughters. Some examples of this: Bangladesh genocide, Srebrenica massacre, Darfur, Rwanda, Syria. So there is a large list here showing that they have not intervened in some very, very large conflicts. Now, these are some of the main criticisms of the United Nations. You're going to encounter people with lots of differing opinions. I think one thing that is important for having an opinion with a lot of like foundational strengths is based on some of the stuff we're going to look at further on as well. So things such as the different branches of the UN, and also a greater look at peacekeeping missions. Anyway, those are the main criticisms of the United Nations.